some tea. I'm done with my AIP protocol training, so I get to eat chocolate today.
Oh my gosh, did you have coffee?
No, actually, I'm gonna have just some tea.
Wow.
I know, weird, right?
I am both surprised and impressed. That's a big change for the teas.
Same.
In a show of solidarity.
Well, I'm glad to know that you're at the end of that.
I was going to say, Kat, to show my solidarity for treating our bodies like temples. I had Chinese food and black coffee for breakfast.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah. It was pretty bad. It's pretty bad.
Yeah, it was.
I'm not happy about where my life sits right now.
Oh no. Okay.
Happy Monday.
I haven't. That tells me how your weekend went right there. If Monday morning is Chinese food and black coffee for breakfast, I got a good idea of what this weekend was like. And I don't know how to feel about it. That's fine. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started this morning by saying good morning, everybody, and welcome to Morning Walk with the Artist Forge, where we learn to think like artists. My name is Nicole York. I will be your host. Joining me today are your co-hosts, Matt Stagliano, Kat Ford Coates, and David Parrish. So glad to have everybody with us today as we get into our Mindset Monday and talk about attitude, your attitude problems, my attitude problems. No, I mean, sometimes it can turn into a problem, but I just felt like it was important this morning to talk about the role that attitude plays in our success in general, not just as artists, not just as artistpreneurs or entrepreneurs or business people, but just in general, and our ability to move forward and get stuff done in our lives, the things that we want to get done. And in particular, the kind of steep slope that we have to tackle as artists trying to make careers out of making things. It is not an easy path to take. Some a little more difficult than others, but all of it requires an uphill battle, and attitude plays a huge role in that. And particularly if we ever have the grit to stick in there long enough to see the things realized that we want to get done. And I know everybody will have a little bit of a different experience with this, but I wanted to begin by asking the moderators today and the audience as well, good grief, the audience, of course, as well. How do you think that attitude has played a role in your career so far? And if you can think of any examples for times, at least personally, where you have really had to get yourself back on the right path as far as your attitude is concerned. I know that this is a relatively constant struggle for me. There are definitely times when I realize my attitude toward my work or toward my clients or toward my peers sometimes has kind of taken a nosedive, and I have to go, wait a minute, okay, that's number one, it's not helpful. Number two, that's not the person we want to be. Number three, we don't enjoy living a life where we feel this way. And so reining in my attitude, changing things around has definitely been something that to battle myself with. And so I want to know, have any of you done the same thing? If you do, what are some things that you do to correct that? But then also, do you have any examples you think, or anything you could share about how cultivating the right kind of attitude is beneficial for getting you where you want to go with your art or your business? I am dying to know. So if you are in the audience today, and you are on Clubhouse, feel free to share your thoughts in the chat, and we will have time for raised hands and bring in folks up a little bit later. If you are engaging with us in any of the other simulcasting platforms on Facebook or YouTube or anything, Matt is monitoring the comments, so feel free to share and ask those there, and Matt will get them to us. Carla says she's sitting on her porch sipping tea. Oh, that sounds like a wonderful way to start the morning. All right, y'all. So what do you think? How do you think attitude plays a role in our success as artists? And what are some things maybe we can do to cultivate the right kind of attitude?
I think, man, I'm just kind of smack dab in the middle of all of this. And wow, that's really loud, isn't it? I'm smack dab in the middle of trying to figure out my attitude and my mindset lately. I've been all over the map. Maybe it's the Chinese food and coffee in the morning. Who knows? But I think that's symptomatic of where my attitude is right now, where I'm just not focused the right way. I'm not digging what I'm doing. I'm not in the studio creating the way that I want to. And I think there's just a myriad of things. It's all the plates that I'm trying to spin. It's the house renovation. It's work. It's coming out of a really long winter, and now we're in mud season here in Maine, and there's just a lot to be able to bring you down and just spin you into this feeling like, what I do doesn't matter. I think the thing that keeps me going and is core to who I am is the faith in myself that it will work out, that I'm putting all those steps in place, that no matter what, I'll always wander back to that center line, that true north, that real direction that I'm supposed to be heading. And it's the never give up, never say die, embrace the suck, however you want to phrase it. I just have to move forward with this. Sometimes it's to my detriment for staying in something far too long. But I think it always serves me well to persevere and get through whatever shitty time I might be in. I know that they've all been passed before, and that I've always gotten back on track, and have always, seen some level of success. So for me, it's that repetition of historical pattern that I always come out of it, and that there's always something better at the end of it. So no matter how it might seem right now, just keep moving forward. If you don't like the work that you're producing, try something different. Just keep moving forward. If your business is low, start networking, start marketing more, just keep moving forward. And I think that's the thing for me, where I didn't used to do that, and I would spiral down and stay in that place for weeks or months at a time. Now those periods are much shorter. I can, correct that attitude much more quickly, but it doesn't stop it from occurring. There are always going to be cycles to this. So for me, especially on a Monday morning like this, where things are they feel like they're falling apart minute by minute, it's just one day. I'll be around tomorrow, and I'll take more pictures tomorrow, and I'll get my business back on track tomorrow. So I think that's the attitude that I have, that it's all temporary. Just keep moving forward.
I love that. And there's like three things that I want to look at here. One question, and then two just kind of observations. And number one, I think the fact that you mentioned that our attitude is going to respond to the cycles in our life as well. And we've talked about seasons before, seasons of motivation, or seasons of inspiration, or seasons of lots of work versus seasons of not much work at all. I think it's important to recognize from the outset that you're absolutely right. And our circumstances are going to change. And as they change, our attitude is going to have to change to fit it. And it is okay to realize when we are in a season where we're going to have a little bit more trouble having an attitude that makes us happy, right? Because sometimes our response is to get bitter, or to get frustrated, or to get angry, and to not make ourselves feel guilty for that, to just recognize it's just going to be a struggle for a little while, and that's okay, and not make things worse by shaming ourselves internally. I think that's so important. And to look at our history and say, no, we've been through places like this before, always get through it, gonna be okay. I think that's so important to recognize. And then the other one is, the Mondays, right? Like everybody talks about that. And I've always wondered to myself or thought to myself, it's so wild how irritated we get about Mondays and how much of that is a cultivated attitude and a habit of thought that happens purely because we feel like it's supposed to, and not necessarily for any really good reason. Because I mean, as artists, we're trying to do jobs that we love, right? And there's a lot of reasons to be really glad to get to work. And I wonder how much cultivation of that attitude actually contributes to the way that we feel. And if we were to begin purposefully cultivating a different attitude, I wonder if Mondays wouldn't seem so bad, or if that is just the way that things are and Mondays suck for everybody in general. But the other thing is, I want to ask you, um, when you start realizing that and you start wanting to change the attitude that you have during the day, what do you do? Or is there anything you do, or do you just let things run its course? Or do you take a purposeful role in trying to go, okay, I don't want to feel this way. What can I do to start changing things?
Yeah, a couple of things there. So the Mondays, Mondays are a construct, right? So I haven't known what day it was in probably 2.5 years. No idea what day it is most of the time. So Mondays, it just so happens that it coincides, and I think people understand what Monday means, right? I think it's just some weird construct. What do I do to get out of this attitude? A lot of times, to interrupt the pattern, I just completely shift what I'm doing. I'm like, I'll go down to grab my keys and I knock my coffee over, and then I stand up and then I drop my keys. And then as I'm bending over to grab my keys again, I hit my head in the wall. Like it's that sort of thing where you have to just step back and laugh for a second and do something totally different. For me, interrupting that pattern and doing something so completely different than what I was doing at the moment. Something's not going right at the computer, get up, do something with my hands. Something's not going right in the house, get outside, play with the dog. Something to just completely reset and get me out of the task so that I don't start looking for other things that will just reinforce my bias that I'm pissed off. Right. I can start looking around and then being like, oh, and the house is this, and I've got to fix that, and this client and this work and blah, 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 blah. And now every place that I look catches that bad energy, that bad attitude. And I don't want that. So if I can just kind of switch it up and go to something completely different, interrupt that pattern, then I have a much easier way of snapping out of it and, just moving forward with the day. That's how I do it.
Okay, I love that. I think that's fantastic advice. So change your circumstances. That's a good one. That's a really good one.
And I just got in the comments here in the live stream from a Facebook user. If you're using it on Facebook and you're watching StreamYard, just make sure that you let it have permission so we can see your name. The attitude that we bring to things is what we'll get back. Sometimes it's hard, but we have to choose a positive attitude even in times of suck. Yes, I agree 100%, because that will turn things around.
Love that. Okay, I think that was a really fantastic place to start, especially remembering that caveat that things are going to move in seasons, that sometimes we're just not going to be happily bubbly all the time, and that's okay. But also recognizing that we do have the ability to do something about that. If we can recognize it, we can change our circumstances and see how that helps bring us back into alignment with an attitude that makes us happier to have. And then also, I think, Matt, the fact that you mentioned at the core this kind of grit that is there, that's like, hey, if it sucks, that's just too bad, I'm going anyway. I think having that kind of as a core discipline or a core personality trait is definitely one of those things that's going to get you to a point where it doesn't allow the attitude to have undue influence over the course of your life, right? Like it might have over a too large of an influence over your day, or over your weekend or whatever, but making sure that that doesn't become a rudder that steers the rest of your life around, I think it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I mean that's a big part of it, right? Is we can choose to let ourselves be influenced by what are just thoughts, really, right? So we can choose to let ourselves go down that hole, or we can choose to not. and choose something different, choose to feel something a little bit better, or just completely off of what we were doing, so that it just gives our mind a chance to rest. So I'm a big believer in switching patterns in the moment, but a lot of times, you don't necessarily realize it. I fall victim to it all the time, right? I'm going to be pissed off for the next 15 minutes. All right, it is what it is. But just make sure that you don't stay there, because that starts to set in that attitude that you carry around with you, and that negative energy, and no one needs that.
For sure, because when you fall into those patterns, that becomes part of your personality. Like you're training your neural network to move in a certain way, which is not a great idea. And it's interesting, as you were talking, I just had a correlation in my head. As a military spouse, oftentimes people will say to you things like, I just don't know how you do it. I don't think I could handle having my spouse leave and be in dangerous places for, a year at a time, or however long they happen to be gone. And it's interesting to me because that attitude, my response is always, what, am I just going to leave him? No, obviously not. Like, what, are you just going to quit? No, obviously not. So what good does that attitude do you? It does you zero. It does you zero good. So yeah, I think that becomes a benchmark a little bit, is to recognize that the emotions are going to come rolling across, just like clouds roll across the sky. And then the danger becomes when we hold on to them, doing exactly what you just mentioned, when we sit there and we ruminate and we grab them and we just chew it over and over again and just hang on to it and don't let them pass. And all of a sudden, then it starts to become a habit of thought. And I think that's definitely where the danger lies. So I want to make sure that we have a chance to hear from everybody this morning. So if you are just joining us, we're talking about attitude and how our attitude impacts our ability to create work or to become successful artists. And so far we've talked about the fact that, as our circumstances change, our attitude is going to change. And we've looked at a few things we can do if we find ourselves in an attitude that we're not happy with, that doesn't, make us want to keep getting up and going to work every day, and how sometimes grit can play a role in the ability to get through those times, and how changing our circumstances can also help us switch our attitude around. So I'm curious, for David, Kat, and Becca, what are your thoughts on how attitude impacts our career or our success as artists? And do you have any examples you're willing to share?
Well, can you hear me now?
Yep, gotcha.
So I think attitudes are very much self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So if you wake up and you're like, well, Monday sucks and everything about Monday sucks, your Monday's probably going to suck, because you're going to already be mentally priming yourself, which is the performance psychology speak for, yes, it does, for, basically looking for the things that you're looking for. You've primed your brain to go out and find the suck of the morning. And so, of course, if you believe that, then you're going to notice, give way to, or remember all of the ways in which your day sucked, because Mondays are supposed to be that way. Likewise, doesn't anybody who's ever been in a relationship knows, you come home with a crappy attitude, it's probably not going to be very long before you get a crappy attitude back. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I know it's been a while since I've been here, but you guys have heard me say multiple times, the thing that I like to ask myself is this helping me in this situation or harming me in this situation? Is it adding to a strategy that's going to do something different for me, or am I just basically doing something that is going to do nothing but give me like a woe is me type of response? And for me, if it's not helping me, then it's probably not doing anything for me that can make some change come around. And then that's how I identify that something needs to change. Is if it's not going to help me, then it's probably taking away from my joy and my productivity long term, and that's something that I need to start working on changing.
Yeah, for sure. I love the idea of kind of looking at attitude as a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think you're absolutely right. In a weird way, it's kind of the Bader-Meinhof effect, right? Like once you decide, or once you see something, and then you start seeing it everywhere, and all of a sudden there's a million reasons why everything could be bad in the exact same circumstance where a change of attitude could make you believe that everything is fantastic. So I love looking at it from that perspective. And I wonder then, so you said, that's how you notice. So when you start to notice that you're at, like, what are the signals to you that this is going in a wrong direction? And what are some things you do to start changing your attitude?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as we've talked about in the past, I tend to be, I've spent well more than a decade now in being in tune to the way that I feel often. Um, and this is not the best analogy, but I'll use it anyway. It's in the same way that people who are addicted to things tend to get too attuned to their physiology when they're chasing a high, because they know when their physiology is off, so they're trying to get high again to correct it. You can obviously do it healthy and know, like, basically everything from your heart rate and how when your heart rate or your blood pressure is elevated, you can start to feel it, or all the way down to just kind of knowing what my baseline mental status is and when it's off. And obviously, the earlier that you can get into prevention mode or change mode, or say, hey, something is different, you can start looking for those things that made it different. So for me, that's usually step one, is just I'm noticing that something is different. I'm not at baseline. And then from there, I could start looking at all of the reasons why. Now, a lot of my strategies are the same, right? Like I I seek out people who are trusted companions that I can always be like, hey, let me bounce some ideas off you, or let me talk to you about what's going on. Or I can just, again, pretty much strategy one is, okay, this is how I feel. How is that? Does that make sense to the environment or the situation I'm in? If it doesn't, again, I need to start looking a little bit deeper, or I need to start asking my questions about, is this going to be helping me in this situation, or is this harming me? I think too often, especially for negative emotions, we tend to believe that they're always bad, right? Like anxiety is always bad. But if you have a little bit of anxiety about walking down a dark alleyway in a really bad part of town, that's actually good. It's making you alert. It's there for a purpose. Um, and so yes, you start to do that analyzing and seeing whether or not this is something that's going to work for you in this situation or against you. I just think you get much further and know whether or not something is good for you or bad for you.
For sure. And so one of the things you do, you mentioned, is kind of seek out trusted people. Do you ever look to gratitude to help kind of correct a bad attitude?
I'm sorry, we were trying to determine whether or not my son has pink eye. Um,
Oh no.
I think it just looks bloodshot to me. But I was getting the my medical advice that I don't think I've ever seen pink eyes. I don't know what it looks like. Um, so I do believe in optimism wed to reality, right? I don't think that you should, I don't believe in the concept of like fake it till you make it. I would rather make it until I make it. I don't really aspire to this, like, I'm just going to ignore everything that sucks, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to give weight to everything that sucks. Sort of like what Matt was saying is, if I have 15 minutes of a day that's bad, sure, I can sit there and say, logically, like, that was a really crappy 15 minutes and I didn't like it. And I don't want to stay in it, but that 15 minutes is what it is. It sucks. Whatever it is that stopped me. If my car got rear-ended this morning on my way to wherever, that's going to suck. All this process that goes into that's going to suck. Calling insurance is going to suck. Like, I'm not going to really enjoy any of those things, but they don't have to start filtering into other domains of my life. I don't have to give that incident power over everything that I do moving forward. I can just isolate it to what it is related to, and deal with it as to what it's related to. Again, I think if you kind of get into that attitude of, well, this is going to wreck my whole day. Of course it is, because you're telling your brain to look for all of the ways that this is trying to wreck your day moving forward.
Ooh, I love the idea of isolating it and not giving it more power than it deserves based on the circumstance. I think that's another thing that's hopefully a really great piece of advice that people take to heart. And I think we've had some really good ones so far, as far as changing your circumstances, reaching out to people that you trust, making sure that you are kind of only giving that attitude or those negative emotions the power that they deserve based on the circumstances, not holding on to them for too long. I think all of that so far is really practical things that people can take and use to help change an attitude that they're not happy in. And I think that that's the kind of part of the key of this conversation this morning, as you mentioned already, is and Matt mentioned as well, is first being able to recognize it, because we often live so much in our bodies and so much in our emotions that we don't recognize our attitudes as something that we can change. We just they just happen to be there. It's like the wallpaper in a room or something. You just feel like that's how things are right now. But they are absolutely changeable. They're completely malleable based on circumstance. And we really do have a lot more power over what we think and feel than we realize. So I think beginning from there is a really great place to just have a good foundation for this conversation overall. And I know David has mentioned this before, and he mentioned it just a second ago, but using your physiology and your reactions to things and how you feel as a red flag to go, okay, wait a minute, something's going on right now, something I'm clearly not happy about. Let me think about how I can, or what caused this, and does it need to be there, and is it helping or is it hurting? So a kind of a great barometer to look at things. Kat and Becca, I'm curious from your perspective, and then friends in the audience, I know we're getting a little bit of comments in there, and I will share MJ's comments in just a moment. But Kat, Becca, what do you guys think? What are your opinions on attitude and how it affects our ability to be successful artists? And what do you think?
I mean, the decision that you make about a situation is coming from your mindset, from that attitude, right? So like David was saying, like, you can decide that everything is shit, right? And start looking for ways to support that decision or that choice or that hypothesis, actually, is I think a better way of putting it. And for me, typically when I find that I'm in that space, I'll get pretty quiet, right? And like kind of go into my head and analyze, like, okay, is this true? Is this real for me right now? What can I do to shift that, toggle that switch, right? Or do I even want to? So sometimes that's just, you know what? I'm going to go take a damn nap. Like, I'm getting out of this situation. I'm just exiting the circumstance and the habitat and putting myself into something completely different, right? Like Matt was saying earlier, go play with the dog. Or for me, like, I will just go and disappear for a minute, change the music that's playing. Lately, my staff has been like playing the hell out of this one playlist. And every time I walk in the studio, I'm like, God, again? And it's like, no, they enjoy it. Like, they're getting something out of it. Why is it bothering me? Because it wasn't mine. Like, no, I'm just tired of it and I want a different vibe and all of the things. But I'll look for things that are annoying to me in that situation. And that's when I know it's like, okay, Kat, take a beat. There's nothing actually wrong with the situation. You're just being a bitch. And I have to like completely change my circumstances. I might go and lay down. I might sit down and journal to sort of like work my way through it mentally. And that's where like that gratitude kind of space comes into play for me, is when I can sit down and actually like itemize, what am I grateful for right this second? What's happening that's going well? Or what lessons am I learning from this? Because if I just sit and stew in that place, like, the whole world goes to shit and that day is just gone.
Yeah, oof. I'm so glad you mentioned what you tell yourself about the circumstance is what you're going to believe. And I know we've talked obviously in this room about the power of story many, many times, but Matt mentioned getting rear-ended, right? and that's going to suck. Or to David mentioned that getting rear-ended, and that's going to suck, and that's okay for that to suck, and you can recognize that. And even in moments like that one, you really still have quite a bit of power. And I'll just give a quick example. I was actually rear-ended, not recently, it was a little while ago, at a stop sign by the person behind me. And I don't know if they just had bad brakes or what the deal was, but it was my first accident as a driver, which is pretty good. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is, my first thought was one of, thank God nobody was hurt, right? I'm okay, they're okay, we're okay. And that gratefulness made everything else seem not as bad. Like, okay, yes, this sucks, but we're okay, and thank God for that. And that became a kind of a balance to everything else, because it was able to put me in a mindset that the story I told about the situation was one that allowed me to not just fall off the edges of panic, which is what somebody with anxiety is very likely to do. And so even just, the way that we train ourselves to look at a situation, and I know my kids have done this to me, I try to, or have tried to over the years, help them not to dwell in the negative side of a circumstance. And sometimes that comes back to kick me in the face, because something negative will happen and I'll say something about it, and then they'll be like, but at least it's not like this. I'm like, I don't want to hear that right now. I did. But I mean, it's a true habit of thought that we can build for ourselves. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves about the circumstances that we're in are so clearly going to influence our attitude and how we feel. And then the trick just becomes training ourselves to tell the kind of stories that help us, as David was saying, rather than harm us. So do you do the same thing David does, Kat? Do you start to recognize, is it your thoughts that catch you up, or is it your physiology that catches you up? Or how do you even come to terms with the fact that, oh shit, I'm in an attitude that's not going to be helpful?
Usually when something negative comes out of my mouth, or I can feel my expression change, and I'm usually just sort of staring at someone or something, zoning out in like this really judgy way. Like I can feel my face doing it. I'm doing it right now. uh, and that's the first kind of bell that I get when I'm in like a really negative space. If I'm in a desperate space, I can feel it in my gut. Like, oh my God, I have to book that client. My credit card payment is due, and I way overextended myself this month. And oh fuck. And like my entire core just turns upside down. And that takes a little bit longer for me to shake, right? Because the anxiety that's wrapped around whatever that desperation is or might be, like is a little tougher for me to pull apart. Um, so yeah, if it's like a desperation place, I feel it in my gut. If it's just a shit attitude, I can feel it in my face.
Oh man, that's so interesting. And I bet there's people out there who can definitely identify with that. And I know what you feel like when you mentioned the desperation. I knew exactly that feeling. I used to call it the green feeling, but yeah, I know that one, and you're right. That is such a hard one to get away from. Um, so I want to make sure to share some comments from listeners today. So MJ said, I feel the same with knowing when your blood sugar is low. I haven't had enough to eat, or you're using exercising and you can feel restless when you miss that regular movement. When I recognize that I'm not feeling at that baseline of doing the things I need to do for myself, and it can make a huge difference in my outlook. And those are all really fantastic examples. Like we many of us recognize when something is off with our physiology, right? In the ways that MJ mentioned, like, oh, I haven't eaten in a while, or I'm really thirsty, or something like that. The signals that our body sends to our brain. And I think we often need to sensitize ourselves, or to remind ourselves to start looking for those emotional signals as well, or, however it seems to fit best for us, like Kat said, in your face, or when you hear yourself say something negative, all of a sudden it's like, oh, whoa, okay, I caught myself there. And probably all of us will have something that's just a little bit different. But I think using those as examples of ways that we already pay attention to how our body is responding to circumstances are ways that hopefully we can help sensitize ourselves a little bit to how our emotions are going. So, Matt, is there any comments today on the socials anywhere that we need to get to?
No, not just yet. Like I said, the attitude that we bring to things is what we'll get back. That was the one that we got there. So nope, nothing else just yet.
Perfect. Which falls right in line with David's, your attitude is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So a lot of wisdom this morning. Becca, dying to hear from you. What are your thoughts on attitude, how it contributes to our success or lack thereof of art, in our art, and then what do you do? How do you handle your attitude?
So I'm kind of stewing on this because I want to be wise and have great thoughts here, but I know that I definitely get real caught up in whatever my attitude will be. And when it comes to them being self-fulfilling prophecies, I mean, that is so incredibly accurate. Probably for everybody, but I know that is that way for me. And I often try to really formulate my attitude on something from the get before I allow it to become its own monster. If that makes sense in a way. Like, I feel like I'm very susceptible to those kind of Pavlovian triggers that'll set me into an either really good or really bad attitude. And I'm glad that you brought up story, because that was kind of what I was sitting and stewing on a little bit. And one thing that I have told myself, and I know I've told a lot of people, and I don't always know if they think it's as happy-go-lucky as I do, but in regards to when things are intimidating or anxiety-inducing or scary or whatever it is, I tend to at least think, well, at least we're going to have a good story about this. Whatever happens, it'll make a funny story in next week, next month, next year. And I try to apply that to most things and approach almost anything with a kind of attitude of curiosity, if that is a way I can describe an attitude. Because then at least if I'm interested in what's going to happen next, if I'm interested in that progression of that story, I'm going to be engaged. I'm going to be more or less positive about it. And I found that when I do have more negative trained attitudes about certain situations or scenarios, I am no longer interested in change. I'm no longer interested in learning about what is happening or who I'm involved with or whatever that is. So when I can push myself to be interested in the progression of that, in learning something new about it, in being curious about it, I feel a massive, massive attitude shift and can then start to go into something a little more excited and a little bit more positive. And I tend to maybe in general be a little bit blasé. I don't know if that's quite the right word that I want to use, but nonchalant maybe is more accurate about most things, even when things are very, very serious, because it allows me to have that sense of curiosity and fun and laughter about it. Even when things are very serious or scary or negative, at least, again, I can think about the story. I can think about how interesting it is psychologically or, on whatever level. And that really works very well for creating an attitude shift when I need it.
Ooh, it's so interesting. It sounds like in a way you're kind of stepping outside of yourself to look at yourself like a main character in a story, rather than necessarily being the one experiencing everything without that kind of fourth wall between you and what's going on.
I wouldn't even say necessarily main character. Often I would say it's looking at other people in my life if they are irritating me and causing me to have bad attitude, or situations as the main character, and I'm considering it more as audience and trying to look at every facet of the situation to change my perspective and thus change my attitude, as opposed to focusing on myself.
Ooh, I like that even more. That's super interesting. I'm going to be thinking about that one for a while, because I think that's a really cool viewpoint to take on the situation. And yeah, ooh, that's an interesting one. I like that. Okay, so if you're just joining us today, we are talking about attitude and how attitude plays a role in not only our success as artists, but as entrepreneurs and people in general, and things that we want, things that we can do to change that. And I think it's important too, as we have this conversation, just to recognize a little bit the role that attitude plays from a negative perspective so that we can see why this attitude change is so important. Because I know personally a lot of folks I love very much who have a tendency toward a negative attitude in general. And very often, we don't realize when we are those people, we don't realize how we're affecting the folks around us and how those interrelationships negatively affect our ability to not only live a life we want, but to have the kind of success that we want in the career field that we're pursuing. And so, imagine, if you will, the way a client is going to react to you if you just show up with a shitty attitude and you're irritated and you're bummed and, everything has gone wrong that morning, and you show up and you're supposed to work with somebody. And even if you try to put a good face on it, how sometimes just having that shit attitude is going to impact your ability to be able to work with or for that person. Wow, that was loud. And then in the long run, if that becomes a repeat thing, right? If this attitude becomes just a part of your personality, how that's going to affect people's desire and willingness to want to work with you in the long run. I mean, you can imagine having somebody on set or having somebody as part of your team, and you just know every time they show up, they're going to be bummed out and they're going to bring the tone of the whole room down, and just all of that stuff is going to snowball. But often when we're in it, when we're in that attitude, we can't see it for what it is, which is why some of these techniques, I think, for recognizing that are so important. So I wonder if y'all have anything that you'd be willing to share on times when you have either maybe been the person or you have seen that negative attitude impact your ability to get things done or the people around you. And what did that look like? And was there a way out of it? Like, were you able to solve that situation, or how did that turn out? Just if anybody has any examples.
I think I find myself in situations a lot of times where I'm noticing negative attitude in other people in situations that I'm in, whether it's a shoot or a job or, working with a business offsite or something. There always tends to be, I tune into in a hyper focused way to what people's attitudes are. And I can almost immediately find the folks that are going to be an issue, as I throw my air quotes up, but not in a bad way. It's just that attitude is going to spread and throw things off for the rest of the shoot if it remains and is let to fester and kind of spread like this little attitude virus. And so I always try to nip that in the bud, whether redirect or face it head on, talk to them privately, talk to them publicly, depending on the personality and the situation. But I find that if it's left to just kind of brew and grow, then things aren't going to get any better. For me, it follows the same thing. If I can notice that in myself and I'm in a group of people and maybe I'm not bringing my best to the shoot, I have to step back and readjust that, because it's not about me. It's about serving the people that I'm with. So it's a matter of putting my own ego and my own wants and desires aside for a second and work for the betterment of the group that I'm in if I want to see any level of success. But it goes both ways. Either I have to take myself out and have that conversation with myself, or I have to have a conversation with somebody in the group. But either way, we've got to stay focused on that long-term goal of what it is we're trying to produce, whether it's a job or a PowerPoint presentation or a picture. It doesn't really matter. I think it comes down to everybody's got to be on that same wavelength, especially if you're working in a team, or it can just kind of fall apart and you're just treading water. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's a fantastic example. And as you were describing that, I was trying to think if I had anything to share. And I'm going to share something that's a little bit embarrassing, but I think plays into what you are talking about, in the fact that I just did not either have the desire or the willingness to step in and have that conversation with myself. So prepare for me to embarrass myself a little bit, y'all. But here we go. At the start, when NFTs for photography were really kind of taking off, I was lucky enough and blessed enough to have some friends who were already in that space, who invited me in, who explained things to me and were like, hey, go and, have a look at this and give this a try. I think this is something that could be really great for you. And I was like, okay, awesome. So I did. I was lucky enough to get an invite to Foundation, and I set everything up, and I took an image that I really wanted to be a Genesis piece, a shot that I really loved. And I went ahead and I put that up, and I was promoting it, and I was seeing almost all of my friends in photography who were doing the same thing, were selling pieces, and I was so happy for them, and I was psyched, and I was like, yeah, this is going to happen. Like, this is going to be the great new market for my photography. Nothing ever happened. I never sold a single piece. And over time, anytime I would think about it, I would start to feel like irritated and resentful and despondent. And pretty soon, just like talking about it, I didn't even want to talk about it anymore. I was just so disgusted. And not with my friends, obviously, but with myself and with my lack of performance in that space. And unfortunately, what happened is, because I had that nasty attitude and I didn't do the work to take myself aside and be like, hey, there's never been a promise you're going to sell anything anywhere. Maybe focus on building community instead, and just see where that turns out, and do this because you love it, not because you think you're going to get a payout. Like, I didn't ever do that for myself or kind of force myself into that space. And what that ended up resulting in is me just essentially abandoning even trying to promote those pieces. I just kind of went, nah, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it. Nobody better talk to me about it. Just a really gross, nasty attitude. And if I had changed my attitude, or, taken myself aside and been like, hey, let's think about this in a different way, in a way that's actually going to serve us, and not in a way that just pisses us off every time we think about it, maybe I would have sold a piece. And I'm sure that some of my negative attitude was manifesting itself in the ways I was trying to promote. I mean, that energy that goes out absolutely does come back to you, as has been said already. Like that, I'm sure my attitude was transmittable or translatable somehow in the way that I was trying to promote. I'm sure it probably didn't come across the way that it should have. There probably was some kind of nastiness there out of my own sense of like, well, maybe I'm not good enough to sell anything, and of course there's all of these extenuating circumstances, right? Any kind of art market is volatile, and your work may not hit the right people, right? There's all of the reasons I would tell somebody else, but for some reason I was either incapable or unwilling to do that for myself. And that led to me just completely abandoning something that could have been really successful for me if I would have stuck in it. But I'll never know, because I didn't do it and I was a shithead. So that's relatively embarrassing, but it's an example of how, at least in my circumstances, having a shitty attitude about something and not addressing it and not doing any work to change it just led to an abandoning of what could have been very lucrative. I don't know. And I'll never know unless I decide to go back.
You are not a shithead.
My attitude was definitely shitty, though, for sure.
No, and I do think that is transmutable. Is that the right word? Energy is a thing, and people can feel all of the shit from miles away. And Matt said something earlier that was interesting about, when you notice a negative attitude, whether it's in like a team environment or a sales environment, a client comes in and they're just picking everything apart, or you recognize it just like during a shoot, maybe, right? Like during the process, and you just hear, like, you can feel the shift, but you hear all the negativity coming. And one of the things that I learned a long time ago is you recognize it because it's a mirror, right? You recognize it in yourself too. And it's really a hard pill to swallow when you realize that you're recognizing it because you're also in that space. And you weren't even aware of it. But at the same time, like when I was, running restaurants, a server with a negative attitude will tank everybody's night, or somebody in the kitchen with a shit attitude, just slinging food into the window, like, get it out of here. Rah, 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 rah. And in a team situation, that's really when you have to consider those leadership skills about having the conversation or changing the dynamic of the room. Not necessarily calling somebody out, though that could be part of the process. But really more like, what can you do to lift the space? So that, because when you do call somebody out, that shifts things pretty dramatically, whether it's in private or in front of the world, right? Because now there's humiliation involved and there's shame involved, and that tends to just snowball the world. But when you notice it, the first thing is always check in with yourself. Are you noticing it because you are also in that space, or simply because they're bringing everybody down? I don't really know where I was going with that, but I thought the mirror was a good sort of reflection.
Yeah, that's been a big thing, Kat. And I think, for me, I recognize it because I've been in that spot, right? And I think it's easier just based on experience. If you've gone through something like that, you've gone through picking yourself apart, or you've just had a bad attitude, it's just easier to pick up on it when you're not in that space, but you see it, right? But I love the fact that you turn it back on yourself, because I know for me, I've given off a weird energy sometimes, and it definitely turns into a situation with people that I wasn't expecting it to. I didn't expect things to pass on to them, but it does. And so I think it really behooves us to look at ourselves in those moments if we can catch it. But yeah, I love that point. Absolutely love that point.
Me too. And I think it's so important to think about that from the perspective of the folks that are around us, as Becca was talking about earlier, because the last thing we want is to be the person who, when they show up, people go, oh, great. Here they come. They're going to ruin everything, just like they always do. The last thing we want is to be that person. And I think when we think about it from that perspective, and we notice, like, as you mentioned, Kat, if we start to notice bad attitude everywhere, we really should turn that mirror around or look in that mirror and go, okay, am I manifesting this somewhere? Because the bad attitude could be coming from me showing up. And oftentimes we don't realize that unless we take the work of doing that self-reflection a little bit and going, okay, am I the one manifesting this happening around me because of how I'm showing up? And we have to remember that people work with people, and that we like to work with people we like. And our chances of being that person are so low if we get trapped in these negative mindsets and these negative attitudes that just manifest bad energy around other people. So such a good chance to think about that from an outside perspective too, how that's affecting the folks around you. And, from when you mentioned taking people aside, one of the ways that I've found that is a way we can sometimes approach that if we're working with somebody and they are just manifesting that bad attitude and it's spreading around is when I have had to do things like this, I take the person aside and I ask if they're okay. And I look at the point of view of how can I, like, what's going on? How can I help? You don't seem to be as much like yourself. What's going on? Are you okay? And address those things first so people feel and recognize that when you're coming at them this way, it's not from a place of you're ruining things, you need to quit ruining things. It's from I care about you and I feel like something's going on. What can we do? And just knowing that there's somebody who cares and knowing that there's somebody who is willing to stop and check on them and see that they're okay and try to tackle whatever's going on and help, often is able to help people shift, because misery loves company, but misery would rather not be miserable, right? And knowing there's somebody who cares can often completely flip the switch for somebody, and how they're handling their attitude. So for me, that has worked in the past, just from the perspective of how we can help the people around us to maybe have an attitude shift. But I'd be curious for you all, have you ever been in that situation where it's the attitude of somebody else who's affecting negatively the work that's going on? And have you been able to address that at all?
You know, one of the things that you just mentioned, Nicole, and this ties into a comment that we just got on Facebook as well, is the misery loves company, right? And sometimes that feels good. So the question that we got from Jason from the Facebook group is, how do you get over the idea that sometimes it just feels good to have shit attitude? I can't disagree. Sometimes it does. Sometimes I just want to be miserable in that moment. But how do you get over that idea? Or do you just accept that sometimes it feels good to have a shit attitude and you ride it out? What's your thought there as we were just talking about the misery loves company part?
I think you have to exercise it. You know, it's almost like when you have a whole bunch of energy and you just have to move your body, like you can't just keep sitting still. I think you have to exercise that. And I think we've talked about this before. I think that's where our close friends come in, the ones who know who we are and who understand that this is not a manifestation of our normal personality and will let us complain without judging us and help us get back to that place. Just could be a receptacle a little bit. Kat mentioned journaling. I think sometimes that's a really good way too. Sometimes people do things like we had when I was young and I worked in a restaurant as a prep cook. We had one employee who, when things would just get really bad, she would go outside the back door and shut the back door and just scream her face off, or like kick the boxes, or just get it out, like rah, just let all of that stuff go. So for me, I think sometimes you need to exercise it and let it have its thing so it can move on. But I'd be curious to know, Kat and Becca, what you all think. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull Erica up so we can hear from her before we close in today. But what do you guys think about when it just feels good to be in a shit mood? What do you do about it?
So I love that question. I just think that question is so fascinating, and it's like not the kind of thing we like want to admit to out here publicly. Like sometimes, yeah, I just want to be in a bad mood and I want to be shitty. But I would comfortably say like probably most people have felt that way. And I think, if we analyze our own behavior there, like why am I not willing to change my attitude here, even if it's possible? I know for me personally, I think a lot often it has to do with pride. Like if I've already established my attitude on something that is like inherently negative and really shitty, like I'm kind of too proud to change my attitude. And I'm generally very comfortable with being wrong. But when it comes to like a very, very strong negative attitude, it's embarrassing to admit like, oh, well, I was wrong and I can change and I can be positive in this situation. And so when it comes to turning that kind of in the reverse and looking at other people, if they bring that negative attitude into the workplace or, into the social setting, wherever you are interacting with other people, I think that gives us that opportunity though to look at like, why are they having a shitty attitude right now? Are they afraid? Are they anxious? Are they proud? If you know them intimately, can you make those judgments on their character to better understand where it is that they're coming from? And what can you do then with your own behavior and within the context of a conversation or whatever it is to address those potentially frightening, anxiety-inducing, whatever issues that might be lending themselves to their behavior. So it does take a very, I think, acute level of emotional intelligence to be able to do this well, to be able to read people, to be able to change your own behavior to help shift someone else's behavior. But I think starting with looking at yourself when you have wanted to be in a shit mood and understanding what keeps you there and what keeps you from changing once you recognize it can then be a good starting point for learning to turn that back towards other people and hopefully make some positive change.
Ooh, that's so good and so interesting. And I love that you were able to tie the previous thing in with this as well, because I think you're absolutely right. Super interesting. And I know probably nobody wants to admit when it feels good to be a shithead, right? Like just to be a jerk and to exercise those feelings. And that used to be known as venting your spleen, right? Just to get that bile out. And I really think that that's a big part of it. But also, as you said, the pride there. And it feels really good to imagine that our anger or that our feelings are righteous ones, right? Like we have every right to feel this way. In fact, the situation is so bad, it would be wrong to not feel this way. And once we're past those emotions and we can see them cleanly, all of a sudden we realize, okay, maybe we didn't have that. But if we were to admit that, then that would be saying I was wrong and I had a bad attitude and it didn't deserve the reaction I gave it, which then, of course, brings your ego into question and all of that stuff. So I can absolutely see it working that way and giving us insight, as you were saying, into, well, how do I handle it when somebody, it doesn't have a bad attitude because, you know, they're scared or sad, but their bad attitude is just a result of knowing they have one, but not wanting to admit that they do.
Yeah. So Jason added a follow-up question here that I think is also then interesting. And he says, I've noticed that sometimes it's easier for people to bond over mutual discontent rather than positivity. And I wonder then if, I mean, I feel like I've witnessed this, but like some people will really kind of internalize that and they will put that out into the world. And I've definitely experienced this from other people where they'll take that negative slant all the time. And I wonder if that's maybe how they've learned to connect with other people. And so even though it isn't necessarily working with other people and it might be negatively impacting you when you're working together or hanging out, they are actually reaching out in a social context and trying to relate to you, because humans have this kind of, oh, there's a term for it that I can't remember, but we're kind of programmed biologically to notice the negative and to latch onto the negative. And so I wonder if it is
The
something
negativity bias.
Yes, negativity bias. Thank you. It's early. So I'm curious, how many people really have tried to utilize that as a means of connection, even though it is having a kind of adverse effect.
I have something to add to that question, and I definitely want to answer that. But I do, as we're at the end of the hour, I do want to make sure we get to hear from Erica, just in case anybody needs to leave. But I'm going to answer that question from a military perspective, because that's exactly what they do to you. So Erica, before I do, would love to hear from you on what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I find that negativity bias absolutely fascinating as well. Like, negativity sells, negativity does, people, I think, latch onto that. I think almost innately. Like, I think when something bad happens, at least for me personally, I think my knee jerk is that negative attitude, negative feelings. But what I have found is that if I stay there, if I dwell in that, if I have a victim attitude, a victim mentality, it doesn't help me grow. It stifles me. And so I stay the same. So by having a victor mentality and, okay, looking in that mirror, how can I overcome this? How can I change the way I feel? It has helped me to grow. So, keeping that in mind helps me to switch that. But I think innately I always start with the negative. It's just a matter of how quickly I can turn around to the positive.
Sorry, that took me a moment. I got stuck. I had a couple of back channels there. I wanted to make sure that if it was things that needed to be discussed, I got a hold of it. So yes, negativity bias, a real thing, helps us survive, right? If we look at things that are dangerous or bad, we can avoid them, we can survive. Trauma bonding is a real thing. Many people experience this. The military takes full advantage of this. They put you in really difficult situations. They punish you for really stupid things, because the idea is that you will bond over your shared suffering, which is a real thing. And oftentimes those bonds are very deep. And there's interesting psychological and neurological reasons for this. But because you're dealing with the same stressors, you're sharing the same emotions. Sharing the same emotions with people often bonds you very deeply. And the problem is, those bonds are not always the ones you want to reinforce. And this manifests itself by people that you see who will come together over a negative situation, and their relationship never leads to any positive growth, as Erica was mentioning, or any actual benefit to changing or helping the situation. It just becomes a complaint fest. And that is one thing where the military gets it right, is they begin by bonding you through difficult circumstances, but then they give you ways to take those relationships and turn them into something positive, which then makes you feel really deeply connected to the people around you. Whereas in places like online spaces, oftentimes we don't take those negative bonds and turn them into anything positive, they never get turned around to, well, here's how we can take this and make positive action out of it, which is exactly where the danger is. And I think if you go and do any research into this field, you'll be super interested to note how much those shared emotions, and like Erica said, the anger, the negative emotions that drive traffic, is because we have much less ability to control ourselves when our passions are inflamed. And anger is the easiest passion to inflame. And it is also one of the easiest to sustain, which is part of the danger there, not only to the communities that we're in, but to us individually. And sometimes our lives, at least right now, in the way that we've constructed our society, are so safe in general, and so, I don't want to say boring, but boring in general, meaning that we don't have life and death circumstances to constantly give us these wave forms of emotion. So we look for ways to feel alive, and anger is a really fantastic way to do that. And it can be an incredible motivator, but you have to have the executive function or this framework to help allow that anger to run its course and channel it into something productive. And as I mentioned before, the problem is that often there is no productive switch that happens. So people who get in the habit of becoming complainers or using other folks as their complaining sphere, nothing good ever comes of it in the long run. It just maintains a kind of sour odor that you can't get away from. So at least from my perspective, that's the answer to that question. But if anybody has anything else, I would be super interested to hear it.
There were a couple of things in the chat. MJ popped up, it's okay to embrace your feelings. People get a bit of crazy in their eyes when they don't let it out. It's going to freak people out. So she tends to find herself making way too many sarcastic, smart-ass comments and regretting it at least a little bit later. And then she also mentioned, I think middle school is all about trauma bonding. And I know that there were a couple of other comments kind of back and forth in the back channels as well. But yeah, everybody's kind of on the same plane here that, yeah, we all get into that space. And it's okay to, dwell there just a little bit, but don't live there. And I love Erica's victim victor mindset. I come back to that quite a bit myself.
Definitely love that. Okay, I know we have gone over the end of our hour just a little bit in talking about attitude and how that affects us and our ability to move forward with our careers successfully and make the art we want to make and all that good stuff. And we've covered so much fantastic ground, not only looking at the actual results of how attitude affects our ability to get things done, but how it affects the people around us, and then ways that we can notice that we're there, change it if we need to, remove ourselves from those circumstances, all the really fantastic advice. So I just want to make sure that we hear from everybody. If they have anything that they want to add. Any final thoughts on attitude as we finish our Mindset Monday and get ready to move into the week, hopefully being, productive and getting stuff done?
There's a reason I have the word mindset tattooed on my arm, and it's exactly that. It's the constant reminder that mindset for me is everything. And so constant attitude checks is everything. And so long as you're aware of where you sit, I think you're in total control. If you want to choose to be upset, choose to be upset. You want to choose to change your pattern, then you can do that too. So yeah, mindset is everything. Attitude is everything.
And I notice Sarah saying, this is what I'm struggling with my makeup artist. She's amazing, but when on set, she's talking about all the problems she deals with while doing makeup and complaining about her parents and talking about a friend who just died with details. I asked her not to, but no luck so far. It might sound insensitive, but I'm always open when people want to talk to me, and I can say I'm a good listener, but I don't think a photo shoot is the place to do that. Am I wrong? And MJ saying, well, maybe she needs a chance to air her grievances before each shoot. So before we close today, maybe that's something that we can address a little bit, because I'm sure all of us have had somebody on our team or worked with somebody who just has the habit of complaining, or maybe they don't have enough people in their life that they can talk to. And so they have found these are the place I can air my grievances or my struggles. And so how do we deal with those people, if you guys have any insights there before we close down for today?
So I was reading that comment, kind of thinking about it a little bit, and at least in my experience when working with makeup artists and like hairstylists specifically, I've found that often they tend to like to talk. When someone's in your chair, you know, you're either steering the conversation and listening to them talk, and you have to be a good listener, or you're talking to them because it keeps it interesting and keeps the conversation flowing, lets you connect with whoever you're working with. But the excessive negativity that's interesting, I think that maybe MJ's onto something there, where they need the opportunity to air their grievances. And for a lot of people, like, where do we get our social activity? We get it at work. Which is kind of unfortunate. And I know a lot of people have tended to get a little too personal at work, and then it comes back and bites us in the ass. But that's where we have other human beings to talk to and to relate to. And I think in that particular scenario, it definitely lends itself to that longing for personal connection, not to the extreme of, say, trauma bonding, but wanting to connect with someone, to have someone to talk to, and their slant and their approach is to connect over those negativity or negative situations. And I think that is a good opportunity to kind of consider maybe how you can steer the conversation. If you know this makeup artist is going to come in with things to say and want to be talking about them, how can you steer the conversation? Instead of just telling them to stop, they're probably not going to stop. It's their behavior, it's how they are, it's their personality. So what can you do to make it really a conversation and not a one-sided monologue on their behalf into something that perhaps is a little more positive? Like, how can you relate to them and give them what they're looking for, but then still twist it into something a little less heavy?
Yeah, that's a great outlook. Matt, do you have anything there as well?
I mean, I think if it's something that keeps coming up, it's certainly something you have to address, right? Because every client's different, but your makeup artist isn't necessarily changing. And so that's something that I would totally address on the side, maybe after a shoot or before the next one. Just be like, listen, this can't continue to happen. That's not the experience that I want to provide. And the fact is that it's your shoot, you're running it, you're directing it. You have total control over it. And if you're hearing this and it's not providing the experience that you want, you are the person that needs to change that experience for the client, and not sit back and let that continue to, ultimately reflect on the experience that you're trying to provide. So it's a hard conversation to have, but it's one that's necessary if you want to keep providing, a certain level of experience for your clients.
For sure. And I think, I love what Becca had to say about kind of connecting there emotionally and paying attention and seeing how things are going, and recognizing that maybe this is somebody who does not have a chance to vent their feelings or to bond or whatever with people outside of these circumstances. And so I love MJ's insight into maybe that's something she needs to get done before the client arrives. But I also agree with Matt in that I think this is going to sound terrible. I look at this from the same perspective that I deal with my kids. First, I make sure that there's a very clear expectation of what I want. If I'm paying you to be here, this is the experience we're trying to provide, and these are the expectations for how that experience is meant to go and the role that you're supposed to play in that. These are the consequences if that doesn't get met. I have to find a new makeup artist. If the attitude doesn't change and the complaining doesn't change and whatever else it is, then I have to find somebody else. And the way that I approach that is I'm always, anytime I have to do anything like this, I'm always approaching it from a perspective of care for the person that I'm talking to, and make sure that they understand, I don't want you to leave. You're great at your job. I really like you. I love having you here. But the way that you're approaching this doesn't meet the goals that I have for how I want this to get done. And if we can change that and you can come into this situation in this way, that would be the best answer, because I don't want to have to say goodbye to you. I want you to be here. And making sure that everything is leavened with that understanding that that's from a place of care. And then if the consequence doesn't change, or if the circumstance doesn't change, then the consequences come into play. And it's unfortunate when that has to happen. But like Matt said, it is also, that's your livelihood at stake. And so the person who works with you in that endeavor needs to understand that well enough that they can come and contribute and not detract from what you're trying to do.
I would be interested too, in this particular situation, if Sarah, maybe homework for you or something to think about. I mean, do you have a kind of set and trained attitude about this makeup artist when you work together? I wonder if you're going into each shoot with your own kind of negative attitude because you know what's going to happen and you know how the conversation scenarios and what you're going to hear are going to go. And I think, yes, if you have to fire the makeup artist, I think that's absolutely on the table. Sometimes things just aren't going to work out, and attitude and personality are major factors in that. But I would wonder too, what is your own attitude towards this particular work relationship? Is it something that can be changed, or does it need to be eradicated? And it's something to think about too from your own side, not just her own negative attitude. And as a final thought, I suppose, because I know we're well over our hour, that's kind of where I'm at today after this conversation too. What are the situations where I do have a consistently negative attitude about things? And often they are in those kind of safe spaces, like when I'm at home with my partner, and he'll call me out on this. He'll be like, "No, you're doing the complaining thing again," and it's because he's the person who gets to hear it from me, and so I let it all out, and it's too much, and I need to come back and check myself and realize when my attitude shifts just because I feel safe, and that it's not always appropriate. So I think doing that introspection onto what our own attitude is and how it's changing our perspective and then changing our behavior from there is super important.
For sure. And you just said something I just want to touch on before we close. And you said that attitude change because I feel safe. Parents often say, why is my kid always better for everybody else than they are for me? And often it's because they feel safe to let out their negative emotions around you, right? They know that you are not going to hate them. You're not going to stop loving them. You're not going to stop letting them play with their friends or whatever other thing it is that they would be afraid of letting those negative emotions show around other people. It's because they feel safe. And so it is absolutely worth thinking about as we end with thinking of, you mentioned the kind of same concept that Kat was talking about earlier, which is that reflection and maybe seeing that in other people. When we flip that around and go, maybe this person feels safe enough around me and in this environment that they can share these things with me. And number one, that is a pretty big compliment to have, to know that you have created a space where somebody feels safe enough that they don't have to mask themselves around you. That is a pretty big deal. And absolutely something worth thinking about if that is the case. But if it is so, making sure that it's also understood that there are times and places for those things to happen and that a business environment isn't one of them. So just something to think about there, and then just make sure. Yeah. So if you are still here and you want to go ahead and read what's in the chat, feel free to do that. But I am going to have to close it down for today, just by saying we should be aware of our attitude and how it affects not only us, but the people around us. And if we start to see that we are having a negative effect, first, we have to be cognizant enough to catch it. It's not just something that's going to reveal itself to us often. We may be on the receiving end of a difficult conversation, like Becca mentioned. It's safe for her spouse to be able to call her out on those things. And we also need people in our lives who will be willing to help us find that, so we can train ourselves enough to see it, so we can start to recognize the sign, so that we can make changes that are going to be beneficial to us. And I always like going back to David's question that he asks himself, which is this hurting me or helping me? And of course, maybe it's neither, but it's a valid question to ask so that we can get a good understanding of, okay, when I do this, does it result in a good outcome or a bad outcome? Am I happy right now, feeling like shit and crabby and wanting to bite the head off everybody around me? Or is this damaging my ability to get things done, to have a good relationship with people, to work? And if it is, okay, how do I start changing things? And some of the fantastic things that were mentioned in this conversation are changing your circumstances, walking away from what you're doing right now and going to do something else. Maybe get some exercise, or scream into a pillow, or journal something, or just give yourself the opportunity to step away from whatever it is that is contributing to that situation. Then being able to exercise those negative emotions, maybe by talking to somebody that we trust, somebody who will tell us the truth and allow us to vent without thinking that we're terrible people. Maybe that is going out for a run or doing some kickboxing or whatever it is, having that chance to exercise those emotions, looking for things to be grateful about, asking ourselves what story we are telling ourselves about the current circumstances, and if that is contributing to the situation. And of course, there was even more fantastic advice, and the replay will be available here on Clubhouse. And then, of course, you can always rewatch the simulcast on YouTube or in the Facebook group or on the Facebook page. So make sure you do that if you want to go back and kind of revisit some of that advice. But a lot of different ways where we can take control over the situation and over how we feel to make those emotions, not to ignore them, because as MJ said, we need to feel them, they're important, but to not live in them, as David said, to not stretch them out, to make them worse, to dwell so that they become something bigger than what they should be. So super thankful to everybody who took part in the conversation today. Really, really insightful. And I think such an important topic for us to look at, because we are working with people and people are working with us. And if we are bringing those negative attitudes into situations that damage our ability to work without realizing it, because we don't have anybody who can tell us, man, this is not the right attitude to have, then that kind of sucks. So for everybody who is here today, thank you so much. For everybody who's joining us on Mondays and Fridays at 6 a.m. Pacific time, that's 9 a.m. Eastern. We're so glad to have you here. We hope you keep coming back. Remember, if you can't join us here on Clubhouse, the simulcast is always going on. So in the Facebook group and page, also on YouTube, Matt is sharing through Stone Tree Creative. You can go ahead and check that out there. We love having you participate. If you have other thoughts or questions, please head up to the Facebook group. It is pinned above. Make sure we continue the conversations there. And remember, May is Self-Portrait Challenge Month. So however you would interpret a self-portrait that best describes or communicates who you are or what you want to say about yourself, make that art. Head over to the Facebook group, share it in the pinned post in the comments section with the hashtag TAF May Challenge. Also, if you're sharing it on Instagram or anyone else, make sure, or anywhere else, make sure you tag us so we can see it there and go and support you. And of course, there's always the website, theartistforge.com, where podcasts and articles with great information are available. So go check everything out there. We hope you will join us on Friday at the same time, 7 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. That's 6 a.m. for the West Coast and 9 a.m. for the East Coast afternoon for our friends overseas. Have an amazing rest of your week. Go make something incredible, and we will see you all on Friday. Bye, friends.